fall and rise again of national water resources planning in England and Wales. So I'll just kind of briefly introduce myself and then talk about kind of how the scale of water resources planning has evolved, look at it in a bit more detail, and then kind of summarize. So quickly, just about me, I originally studied geography at Exeter, and then I had a few years kind of figuring out what I wanted to do before starting a hydrology master's at Newcastle University. And then from there, I went on to a job at JBA doing flood modelling work. And after a year there, I applied for this PhD back at Newcastle and started 2 years ago. So then what is my PhD? So this picture I kind of drew for a poster from my first year, and it represents how my PhD is looking at kind of which options are needed to ensure long-term resilience of our water supply, and a particular focus kind of in the corner in the orange box on the scale of decision making, so from kind of local catchment decisions up to national level planning. So in this presentation, I take a kind of historical perspective to tell a story really of how the scale of planning has evolved over time in England and Wales. And I'll just start with a slide which gives an overall summary of how this how the scale has changed. So go into a bit more detail later on, but you can kind of see how the general trend is for it to grow from a kind of period of local, fragmented and piecemeal originally, and then it becomes more consolidated and then has a peak, and this is around the 60s, kind of national planning, and then it falls back down to kind of regional planning and then to company zonal planning. And then recently we've seen this rise again of national alongside regional and continued company zonal planning. So this kind of recent phase we're in now is kind of could be described as a multi-scale planning, where you can see it at local, company, regional, national, and with influence from the EU levels as well. So so this graph is quite nice to see that the explosion really of reservoir building in the mid 20th century. But if we just start at the very beginning of pre-industrial to 18th century, you can see that in terms of reservoirs, there's kind of water resources comes from quite modest origin. So in a context of very low water demand and low competition, a kind of patchwork water supply then started to arise to meet the demands of industry and a growing population. And you kind of water resources infrastructure, particularly for canals. So the map on the left is from 1820, and that shows the growth of canals for navigation sort of before railways and roads took over. So we had this growth alongside reservoirs expanding against a kind of background of rapid societal, economic and environmental change. And by the 20th century had kind of very fragmented water provision. So you had hundreds of local councils and private statutory companies resourcing and supplying their local communities alongside other users such as power plants, navigation authorities and irrigators. But at this time, kind of overall coordination was very limited. And then into the 20th century, kind of following some drought events, this kind of revealed a picture of very uneven provision, particularly across rural and urban areas. And to kind of provide a sort of public good of clean drinking water, water resources infrastructure slowly became more consolidated. So you kind of see this with the growing reservoirs, but each new reservoir had to be approved by Parliament. So in Westminster, so kind of with more and more reservoirs being proposed, approval also was facing kind of growing opposition, and it was placing increasing burden on Parliament's time, particularly as debates were complex and quite technical. So they were crossing concerns about industrial competitiveness, the character of the countryside and loss of farmland, flooding rural communities. And so kind of, one example of quite a controversial case is a reservoir that was built in Wales to supply Liverpool. and this drowned Truro Valley, which was considered kind of one of the few remaining bastions of Welsh culture and language. And Liverpool City Council gained approval through Westminster, which avoided a kind of a public inquiry and the need to gain consent from the Welsh authorities, despite almost unanimous opposition. So this kind of top-down approach exposed the Welsh MP's lack of political power in determining the future of Welsh resources, and is said to have added impetus to Welsh devolution. And it's still remembered today. So a peer, Lord Wigley, in 2009, kind of referred to the case in the House of Lords, saying that the experience colours all our considerations in Wales of issues relating to the supply of water to English conurbations. So kind of indicates how there's still a tentative approach from Wales towards water sharing in light of this history. So kind of faced with these complex and contentious proposals for new infrastructure, MPs sought a new system of advice and decision making. And discussions in particular continued over the question of whether national planning should be established. So in 1963, this consolidation kind of reaches its height with the creation of a National Water Resources Board. And this was set up to advise government and 27 river authorities, which were also established then, on the kind of long-term strategic view of water resources planning. And the board was dominated by a staff of engineers with little input from specialisms such as ecology and economics. And they proposed this kind of national water grid with new reservoirs and long distance transfers. So the board had some success. So they did manage to achieve some of this map, but they only lasted a decade, and that was partly because of several problems such as kind of water quality and increasing opposition, particularly to reservoirs, environmental movement, and then also kind of problems with projecting inaccurate projections of demand, particularly with the fall of industry and kind of improving water efficiency. So after that period, we have a new period of integrated river basin management in 1973. So this fourth phase of water resources planning sort of sees the fall of that national system to this new integrated approach. So assets and responsibilities for water resources supply and also sewage were transferred from kind of local decision makers to 10 regional water authorities, or the water boards. And this integrated approach, which was being promoted at the European level, was central to the new institutions, and it represented quite a significant shift from sort of local provision in favour of managerial personnel specialising in finance, operations and planning. But it's also important to note at this time that the reforms didn't extend to private statutory companies, so that those represented about 20% of water supply, and they were not nationalised. They continued to supply as before within these regional water authority boundaries, which were providing kind of sewerage responsibilities. But several problems plagued these boards from the outset. Firstly, kind of a lack of effective scrutiny and accountability with the authorities, both in charge of kind of controlling pollution, but also being the kind of main producers of pollution. And kind of linked to this, they had problems with finance. There was a lack of finance to meet the new treatment standards that were being required by the European Economic Community, which later became the EU, which the UK just joined. And then also in the background, there was wider events adding further pressure. So there was one of the most severe droughts in recent history in 1976, and also kind of growing threat of privatisation after the election of the Conservatives in 1979, which came to fruition in 1989. So those kind of 10 river water authorities were then floated on the London Stock Exchange and became water and sewage limited companies. And these borders have kind of largely remained the same on the left, and then in the middle that's a picture of the 29 existing private water-only companies. So those were the ones that were allowed to kind of continue throughout. And they've also kind of remained similar, but there's been some kind of mergers and acquisitions. So there's a little bit of consolidation there. And then alongside the private companies, privatization also established the other crucial actors, the regulators. So I've got some logos on the right-hand side. But sort of, although it was heavily regulated and steered by government, the institutional arrangements that were established at privatization kind of put water resources delivery in the hands of the private companies, which were kind of clearly incentivized and really legally mandated to sort of prioritize the needs of their own customers. So the scale of planning kind of aligned to these company zonal boundaries, with kind of national water infrastructure off the agenda for a time. And you can see this, so in the southeast, how kind of fragmented provision was, and that was seen as a barrier to improving drought resilience, because they weren't able to kind of implement better network integration. And that sort of drove the formation of a new regional group called Water Resources Southeast in 1997, to encourage intercompany transfers, which has kind of later provided a template for recent approaches. And that compares to in the north, where kind of privatized integration kind of began much before privatization. So got these three kind of large water companies, Northumbrian Water, United Utilities, and Yorkshire Water. Northwest became United Utilities. And these companies kind of inherited some infrastructure, some of which was centuries old, that included things like regulating reservoirs and rivers, aqueducts, pipelines, canals, pumping stations that could kind of move water to where it was needed. So this existing infrastructure plus kind of later investments have meant that now the regions have integrated their almost entire networks, so kind of almost 90% of their customers. And that has had a legacy on the scale of planning. So when the Southeast formed to form a kind of regional collective to encourage transfers between these smaller fragmented companies, that move was not so necessary in the north, as these larger companies with less fragmented borders, and they already had kind of inherited some integrated infrastructure. So the kind of idea of a national grid, it was intermittently considered and rejected, of the kind of envisioned by the Water Resources Board in the 60s. So in 1994, this picture of a grid was rejected on environmental grounds by the National Rivers Authorities, like the kind of precursor to the Environment Agency. And then in 2006, a report by the Environment Agency called "Do We Need Large-Scale Water Transfers for the South East of England?" concluded that they were not necessary, as they put the emphasis on demand management and leakage reduction. And then that message was again repeated in 2008 in the publication of the government's water strategy for England. But yeah, it's also kind of interesting to look at some other changes in the scale of planning. So with influence from the EU, that kind of instigated this river basin management planning from 2009, and then also sort of catchment-based approach, or CABA, in 2011, which is a kind of voluntary initiative established by DEFRA. And these were really about trying to meet the good status targets, which was supposed to be achieved in 2015, although that was missed, to achieve kind of, ecosystem function and good ecological status. So that's kind of at the scale that's been happening so far, but what's happening now, because there have been some recent changes, and that's really the kind of rise again of planning and coordinating on a grander scale, which has gained prominence, partly driven from the drought in 2010 and 2012, and also kind of the resilience being codified in the Water Act of 2014, partly in the face of climate change and also ambitions to improve the condition of the environment. And this was sort of established in reports which found that it would be better to invest in kind of infrastructure now to avoid high emergency costs in the future. And that was sort of being driven by projected deficits, which were partly sort of to do with kind of introducing new frameworks like stochastics and risk-based approaches, which were kind of revealed a wide envelope of risk, but also environmental policy, protecting water bodies such as chalk streams through kind of reducing abstractions, and then also growth in demand from new housing developments and new industries such as hydrogen, and potentially increasing agricultural need in a warmer climate. So this landmark policy report, the national framework, has set targets to tackle leakage and demand, and also introduced this new regional tier of planning, so encourage collaboration across companies. So you can see in the blue, we've got kind of water resources north, water resources east, water resources west, water resources southeast, and west country water resources. And these have been tasked to identify nationally efficient solutions to the resilience challenge. And it may include more cross-border solutions such as water transfers, if they can be demonstrated as having kind of greater benefits than options identified under traditional water company planning. So alongside this kind of new national framework, these new targets to really tackle demand and leakage and a new structure of kind of collaboration, there was also an acknowledgement of kind of the potentially inadequate decision-making frameworks to kind of demonstrate the need for large infrastructure schemes, such as, well, this was kind of exemplified by the rejection of Abingdon Reservoir in Oxfordshire in 2010. And so to progress those kind of potentially, well, they'll call them strategic resource options, schemes such as big new reservoirs and transfers, Ofwat organised a new regulatory alliance in 2019 and made £469 million available in funding for water companies to progress these kind of schemes. So the Regulators Alliance for Progressing Infrastructure Development, or RAPID, represents a partnership between Ofwat, the EA and DWI, with the aim to facilitate these new schemes for construction between 2025 and 2030, so quite soon. And it includes kind of water transfers, reservoirs, reuse schemes. And so kind of coming to the end now, but we sort of can see that that really the kind of combination of these factors of projected deficits, kind of lack of collaboration across the companies, and problems with the kind of decision-making frameworks to justify these big new schemes has driven quite a lot of new policy and kind of institutional changes. So you could say we're now in this transition period with these newly created organisations, and it's quite an interesting time because the draft plans have just been published for consultation. So we will soon kind of see what the public and the regulators and other stakeholders think of the proposals. And in summary, really, just kind of you can see how, well, hopefully I've sort of described how the planning scale has changed. It's influenced by lots of factors, some of which are kind of within or outside of the control of the water resource planners. And you can see this maybe shape going from the kind of local and fragmented, becoming kind of more consolidated until that peak in the 60s of really sort of strategic long-term planning, and then kind of a push partly from the EU for integrated regional planning, and then with privatisation, planning really set up at the company zonal level. But then recently, partly kind of with kind of this challenge of resilience in the face of climate change and improving the environment, we've seen this rise again of national planning alongside regional planning, and whether or not this kind of multi-scale system works, we'll see if it can kind of meet the objectives to improve resilience, improve the environment, and ensure enough water for society, and I suppose not least provide the service within the constraints of affordable budgets. So I think that's it. Thanks for listening.